This channel is part of the History Hit network.
For many Irish, 1917 to 1921 are the four glorious years, when a small band of revolutionaries took on the might of the British Empire and won. However, what isn't spoken about is that during those turbulent years, the same revolutionaries, the Irish Republican Army, not only waged war against Crown forces, they also targeted civilians, many of whom were falsely accused of being spies or informers. These unfortunates were abducted and executed by the IRA. Some were secretly buried, and the remains never returned. We're now entering a decade of commemorations, marking the centenary of key events in recent Irish history: 1916, partition, independence, and civil war. We should commemorate the courage of the men and women who fought for Ireland, but it's now time that we looked at darker aspects of the independence struggle. I spent the last decade researching the dead of the Irish Revolution. During that time, I've encountered the cases of many people who were abducted and executed by the IRA as spies and informers, often on the flimsiest of evidence. In some cases, we don't even know the names of victims, let alone their whereabouts. In the intervening years, most of these victims have been conveniently forgotten, their names lost in a maze of files. In this series, I'll visit various parts of the country to explore the fate of some of these disappeared. For me, their deaths at the hands of the IRA cast a very dark shadow over the history of the independence struggle. In the previous programme, we told how, as the conflict intensified, the IRA grew increasingly paranoid about spies and informers. This led to a wave of killings of civilians, particularly in Cork. In all of Ireland in 1920, at least 26 civilians were abducted and executed by the IRA. In the last 6 months of the conflict, this figure grew sevenfold. In the eyes of many observers, gun law prevailed in Ireland during the revolutionary years, nowhere more so than in County Cork. There, both Crown forces and the IRA fought a very dirty war, with widespread destruction of property, extortion, assassinations, ambushes, and torture. Inside Collins Barracks, formerly Victoria Barracks, the British military organised their war. Outside the walls, the Cork IRA organised theirs. The IRA pursued a particularly vicious campaign against suspected spies and informers in the city and surrounding areas. Cork IRA officer Sean Healy later remarked, "Spies and informers are about the most loathsome people that ever existed and deserve to be exterminated in the same manner as rats or snakes." And the Cork No. 1 Brigade certainly did their best to rid the city of this perceived plague. By the time their killing spree had ended, scores of people had met their deaths in isolated fields and woodlands, all in the name of the Republic. In the aftermath of World War I, many new nations emerged from the ashes of collapsed empires. Irish revolutionaries drew inspiration from this transformation. P.S. O'Hegarty, himself a Corkman, explained the Irish determination to secure a republic. The Dáil would provide the political leadership, the IRA would do the fighting.
21st of January 1919, Ireland's right to and reassertion of her claim to independence ratified the establishment of the Irish Republic. Sinn Féin's message to the people at the first Mansion House public meeting: "The Great War is over, but the Little War is just beginning," demonstrated in actual practice that no country can be held by another country against its determined will unless that other country is prepared to resort to wholesale slaughter.
If you love history, then you will love History Hit. Our extensive library of documentary features everything from the ancient origins of our earliest ancestors to the daring mission to sink the Bismarck. History Hit has hundreds of exclusive documentaries with unrivaled access to the world's best historians. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
Wholesale slaughter was never a feature of the Anglo-Irish conflict, but terror certainly was. Much of Cork City centre was destroyed by fire in 1920 when Crown forces ran amok. Cork was also the most violent county, with about 500 fatalities, followed by Dublin with some 200 fewer. And it was in Cork, at the heart of the revolution, where the disappearance of people reached shocking levels. The numbers abducted, executed and secretly buried by the Cork No. 1 Brigade, under the command of Sean O'Hegarty, put all other IRA brigades in the shade. Nothing was too extreme in their battle for Irish independence. Cork was divided into 3 IRA brigade areas. No. 1 Brigade extended from Youghal in the east to the Kerry border, with Cork City at its heart. To the north lay No. 2 Brigade, and to the south and southwest, No. 3. An RIC report from December 1919 shows how British authority was already crumbling in West Cork.
A system of universal terrorism exists, and this prevents the law-abiding section of the community from asserting itself. The principal efforts of Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers are directed against the RIC, whom they regard as the chief obstacle in their path, and who are now working under a strain which is almost unbearable. Their numbers are too small to deal with the existing state of things, and everything possible is done to break their spirit. The ordinary processes of the law are useless now. The people in general will not give evidence in criminal cases, fearing attack. And police inquiries are met with a refusal to answer any questions or make any statement. Under these circumstances, the police are fighting with their hands tied and can achieve very little, in spite of much hard work. No hope of any improvement under present conditions is anticipated.
Sunday, the 14th of December 1919, saw the first assassination of an RIC constable in Cork. Edward Bulger was shot as he walked from his home to his barracks in the village of Kilbrittain. He was unarmed. A native of Kilkenny, he was married with 4 children. The IRA hierarchy hadn't sanctioned this killing, and the news of his death infuriated Cathal Brugha, the Dáil Minister for Defence. Brugha's protestations were ignored. Such unauthorised killings became the norm. Cork was indeed the rebel county. The historian Peter Hart described the lethal conditions that prevailed there during the conflict.
The political arena was transformed into a nightmare world of anonymous killers and victims, of disappearances, massacres, midnight executions, bullets in the back of the head, bodies dumped in fields or ditches.
But this violence wasn't just directed at Crown forces. It was also unleashed on the civilian population. The IRA's Sean Healy was bitter about the attitude of most people in his area towards the IRA. These he regarded not as supporters, but as enemies. His words reflect the mentality of the Cork IRA leadership.
Only about 1 house in every 100 could be regarded as pro-IRA. The area was infested with British spies and informers, and only for taking drastic action against these people, we would never have survived.
And drastic action is what the Cork IRA took. In his classic memoir, On Another Man's Wound, Ernie O'Malley alludes to IRA headquarters' concerns about Sean O'Hegarty, who commanded the Cork No. 1 Brigade.
He had a biting, gnarled tongue that flayed. East Cork had shot many spies. O'Hegarty had the name of not being very particular about evidence, but that might just be talk. All information regarding an espionage case had first to be sent to Dublin, where the sentence was confirmed by our HQ before an execution took place.
The widespread shooting of alleged spies wasn't just talk. O'Hegarty ignored instructions concerning executions. Otherwise, he would have flooded IRA headquarters with paperwork. Richard Mulcahy, the IRA Chief of Staff, had concerns about what was happening in Cork. This is reflected in General Order No. 20, issued in April 1921. It states, "In all cases of alleged spying, in which, while the evidence obtainable is suggestive of guilt, it's considered to be inconclusive, it shall, before the arrest of the suspected person, be placed before a court of inquiry." Of course, these orders weren't always followed. In recent decades, evidence has emerged which confirms IRA headquarters' suspicions about what was happening in Cork. Jim Fitzgerald, a farmer and local historian from Knockgraha, northeast of Cork City, knew and interviewed Martin Corrie, the long-serving Fianna Fáil TD who between 1920 and 1922 was O'Hegarty's brigade executioner. What Corrie said is extraordinary. As a member of Fianna Fáil, Martin Corrie served 40 years in the Dáil. He often spoke with pride about how he had dealt with Crown forces. During one Dáil sitting, he remarked, "I planted oats on British soldiers, and 'twas good oats." Jim, the most famous person associated with Knockgraha is probably Martin Corrie. What was his response when you first of all asked him, could you record him? Did he mind? Or?
Well, I'd say he was delighted that before he died that someone was interested enough. He had no objection whatsoever to talk away freely and didn't mind it being recorded in any way, like. According to Martin Corrie, the Cork No. 1 Brigade took prisoners out to this cemetery, just a few miles from the city. The British authorities never knew that numerous soldiers, policemen and civilians were taken here, imprisoned for hours and even days, before being removed to a nearby bog, shot and buried. The prison was nicknamed Sing Sing.
Well, who thought he was in Sing Sing first, though?
I don't know. I didn't think of it. But I said it's the most powerful jail in the 26 counties.
Ned Maloney, the so-called governor of Sing Sing, was the only person with keys to the prison. He's said to have kept careful records of those who passed through it.
Yeah, the name of every fella who was duly executed out of Sing Sing. He had 7 tons. 7 tons, he had 17 or 18 cameras. You count them all up, I think I'd over 60 that evening.
The victims of Sing Sing included 2 policemen picked up in Cork City.
The 2 black and tans were picked up in Eminent Place. Therefore, I think what they're looking for diesel or petrol to put into a jeep.
Yeah.
And 2 Cork, Cody and Gray, 2 the toughest IRA men in the city, saw them and they had no gun, but they put their fingers in their pockets and they brought them out here to Knockgraha in a car, and they met Corrie in Knockgraha and they came down here.
Jim, up in the back of the car. Come on, get out, get out. Now the 2 buckers got out and he went, we match, 2 tons. Got a pull over with Sergeant Blunt and Sing Sing. Till from a header. They called him the bucker out along the graveyard. A bit of a calf was off around his neck. And they didn't flatten him out. And quite when see the 2 tons they looked together one another. Now the 2 buckers were trying to Sing Sing anyway, they got their last hours there.
It must have been difficult for the company as well as for the people to see,
Yeah.
see human beings in that sort of...
In that sort of a situation, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was a horror chamber. Well, Eunan, would you like a tour of Sing Sing?
I would, thank you. God, it's very wet.
Oh. I'll leave you here now to contemplate with your thoughts, and I'll close the door and you might get a better feel of what it was like in Sing Sing.
God almighty, what it must have been like for somebody be brought here, probably knowing they're going to die, put in this place where there's almost no light. There's a little light through those holes, but not much. Perhaps sitting on straw, because there wasn't even a bench there then, and just waiting for the end.
Cork City Hall was officially opened by Eamon de Valera in 1936. It was built to replace the original City Hall, which had been burnt down in December 1920, along with much of the city centre. That was an unofficial reprisal by auxiliaries for an earlier IRA attack in which a policeman had been killed. Months earlier, the killing of off-duty Constable Joseph Murtagh in Cork City stoked hostilities further. A widower and father of two, he was returning from a night out when gunned down. Senior IRA figures in the city condemned his killing. Tomás McCurtain, Lord Mayor of Cork and officer commanding Cork No. 1 Brigade, was shocked at Murtagh's killing. He sent his condolences to the constable's family, and he also remarked, "Whoever did this will pay the piper. We can't have men roaming around armed, shooting policemen on their own." Within hours, McCurtain himself was dead, shot by disguised police who burst into his house and killed him in front of his wife. McCurtain's murder provoked a chain of revenge killings, which only ended in the summer of 1922, long after the War of Independence had officially ended. Terence McSweeney was elected to succeed McCurtain as Lord Mayor of Cork and officer commanding Cork No. 1 Brigade. After some months in office, he was arrested at City Hall. Convicted of political offences, he was imprisoned in Brixton Jail in London. There he embarked on a 74-day hunger strike, which drew worldwide attention. After his death, his remains were returned to Cork and buried in St Finbar Cemetery, alongside his murdered predecessor, Tomás McCurtain. McCurtain and McSweeney had been relative moderates. It was now the turn of more ruthless men like Sean O'Hegarty and Mick Murphy. One of their key foot soldiers was Martin Corry, captain of E Company, 4th Battalion. IRA officer Mick Leahy spoke to Ernie O'Malley about Corry's activities.
Mick Leahy told me that Knockgraha was an excellent spot. There were no Protestants in the village. There's a bloody pile of spies. All the spies came from Cork City. Martin Corry was chief executioner. At Knockgraha, there was a graveyard and a vault there called Sing Sing. The same vault that was used at the time of the body snatchers.
Deep in the hills behind me lie the ruins of Martin Corry's farmhouse. In an interview with Jim Fitzgerald, he confirmed that various IRA courts-martials, executions and burials had taken place there after the truce. It was also the location for the last in a series of killings by the Cork No. 1 Brigade, still determined to avenge the assassination of their late commander, Tomás McCurtain. The IRA tracked down members of the RIC gang suspected of involvement in the Lord Mayor's murder. 2 constables were shot dead as they boarded a tram in Cork City in May 1920. Then the IRA turned their attention to Detective Inspector Oswald Swansea, who'd left Cork following McCurtain's assassination. They tracked him down to Lisburn, where they shot him dead as he left church. Swansea's death sparked off rioting that left 22 people dead in Lisburn and Belfast, and many Catholic homes burnt out. But that was not the end of the McCurtain affair. Even after the treaty, the Cork No. 1 Brigade continued their quest for vengeance. In March 1922, they shot Arthur Gloucester, a former RIC sergeant. This series of murders finally ended with the abduction, trial and killing of ex-RIC man Michael Williams. Martin Corry recalled what became of him.
How was he got here?
The brigade got him a bomb coming out from Mass at the chapel gate and kicked his ass into the van and dropped him down here. Well, he was the most cold-blooded bastard we met at the whole lot, nearly. He was the third man up the stairs the night Tomas was shot. Tomas was dead when I arrived in Topsy. They got every one of them.
Department of Justice records support Martin Corry's recollections. The Gardaí reported that Michael Williams had been kidnapped in Laois, taken to Martin Corry's farm and court-martialed by the IRA. He was sentenced to death and shot for his alleged involvement in the murder of Tomás McCurtain in 1920. His body was then buried somewhere on Corry's farm. But we have to remember that this happened in June 1922, by which time there'd long been an amnesty in place which covered all killings of the War of Independence, whether by British or by the IRA. Logically, therefore, William's death was simply murder. Government records show that the Williams family solicitor told the Department of Justice that, quote, by all accounts, this farm sounds like a veritable cemetery. He also enclosed an anonymous letter received by William's mother, which gave a very graphic account of her son's fate.
It is well known about here that your deceased son Michael was taken to Martin Corry's house. The executioners, throwing the end of the rope over a beam, pulled and pulled for hours, while the unfortunate victims struggled and struggled in their desperate agony.
In October 1924, Cork Gardaí reported, quote, reliable information that Williams and another ex-RIC man were buried on Corry's land. And Mrs. Savage actually identified the spot, near a whitethorn tree bordering her land and Corry's. A Canon O'Leary had offered to act as an intermediary to help recover Williams' remains, but he suddenly washed his hands of the matter, and he advised the Gardaí to do the same. Justice Minister Kevin O'Higgins still pressed for a murder investigation, but after a senior Garda had warned of, quote, most damaging repercussions if Corry were pursued, the matter was allowed to drop. It's alleged that 7 bodies were buried on Martin Corry's farm. However, this figure pales in comparison to the number he stated were buried in the Ray, where IRA prisoners held in Sing Sing were taken, shot and buried. The Ray is now a state forest. In the 1920s, it was a bog. Martin Corry maintained that in 1920 and 1921, it was regularly stocked with fresh corpses. Corry told Jim Fitzgerald how some of his men protested at the number of people they were being asked to bury in the Ray. These gravediggers were nicknamed the Rakes. Fed up with the number of bodies they had to bury, they confronted Daithí O'Brien, a senior IRA gunman, and told him they were burying no more.
Daithí got 2 of them below, around Tom Cotter, and he brought them up and delivered them into Sing Sing himself. Yeah, absolutely. The 2 prisoners. And brought me up that night for to shoot them. All the Rakes were above outside, and they were laying down the last. There'll be ghosts enough around this place now. There'll be no more being shot here. Unless they make bacon of them, says Daithí. And all of a sudden, this kick came out of the pocket and bang, bang, he shot the 2 of them like that. Yeah, man, we're home, Corry.
The only redeeming features of Corry's cheerful recollections are the dissenting voices of the gravediggers, but they didn't control the guns. the IRA terror campaign was also having a damaging impact on the Royal Irish Constabulary.
Murder and outrage are universal. The loss of life inflicted on government forces cannot but have a disastrous effect on the morale of the men. The most they can do is try to defend themselves and their barracks. If action is not taken, the RIC will exist only in name.
In response to such pleadings, the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act was passed in August 1920 in an attempt to turn the tide against the IRA. It had little impact. By December 1920, martial law was introduced throughout much of Munster. In this environment, British intelligence gathering on IRA operations and personnel became increasingly effective. The Crown's success led the IRA to become increasingly concerned, even paranoid, about spies. As a result, the last 6 months of the War of Independence saw over 150 civilians killed as spies. In Cork City, both sides had their blacklists. However, as Martin Corry's words illustrate, the IRA's attitude to killing was often quite casual. According to Ernie O'Malley, Mick Murphy would blow smoke out of his mouth and say, "Just shoot them, and just shoot them also." And as the names went on, he'd let out a puff of smoke. As Mick Murphy saw it, Cork was a city of spies. And there's no doubting that spies and informants were an issue for the local IRA. During the summer of 1920, as a result of good information, the Essex Regiment captured 2 senior IRA officers from West Cork. These were Tom Hales and Pat Hart. They were badly beaten, their teeth were broken, their fingernails were pulled out with pliers. Neither man broke under interrogation, but Pat Hart never recovered. He had a nervous breakdown and he died some years later. In retaliation, the IRA stopped a train at Waterfall outside Cork City and took away 3 British officers. One of these was mistaken for the intelligence officer involved in the torture of Tom Hales. The other 2 just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their bodies were never found. The revenge cycle continued. 2 IRA men believed involved in abductions, Leo Murphy and Charlie Daly, were themselves killed in very dubious circumstances. Daly, a young railway worker, was shot in a tunnel at Glanmire Station by a Crown murder squad. He was probably killed in error for another IRA officer of the same name. Less than a week after Murphy and Daly were killed, the IRA abducted 3 British drummer boys who were playing football near Ballincollig Barracks. Matthew Carson, John Cooper and Arthur Chapman were shot and buried near Ovens. The truce was just a week away. The killing of these 3 band boys clearly broke the IRA's own rules of engagement and is indefensible. Thanks to the persistence of one grieving father, Richard Carson, the 3 bodies were eventually recovered. He particularly thanked the Gardaí at Bandon, quote, "They were true gentlemen. Their charity towards the dead gives me many hopes of Ireland's redemption. But we've seen that such charity was in short supply. In Cork, the majority of those secretly killed and buried remain hidden and unnamed." Further up the Lee Valley near the Kerry border lies the village of Inchigeela. There lie the remains of one well-known victim, secretly killed and buried by the IRA. The old cemetery of Inchigeela is where you'll find the final resting place of Lieutenant Cecil Guthrie. He was the only auxiliary to escape from the Kilmichael ambush of 1920. However, he was later captured, killed and buried in a bog nearby. That the IRA were willing to have Guthrie's body recovered in 1926 speaks well for their humanity. But why return the body of a dead auxiliary and not those of many civilians whom the IRA also killed and buried. Caught in a heavy shower, I decided to take shelter in a local hotel. I got talking to the owner. I learnt that Cecil Guthrie hadn't been shot, as is commonly believed. Joe, I've just been up to the graveyard and I've seen the grave of Cecil Guthrie. Can you tell me something about him?
Well, I believe that Cecil Guthrie was buried in Inchigeelagh in about 1926, and it was a reburial. And previously, Cecil Guthrie was buried in Kilmichael in Anahala Bog, which is now Kilmichael Football Club. Sometimes they jokingly call it Guthrie's Field.
Really?
Yeah.
And how did he end up there?
Well, he was one of the drivers that was involved at the Kilmichael Ambush on November the 28th, 1920. And he had escaped from the ambush, and he was trying to make his way back to Macroom to raise the alarm that the ambush had taken place. And when he reached Drumcarra, he attempted to commandeer a truck, but the revolver he was carrying the ammunition was spent, so instead he was arrested, and he was handed over to local IRA men, and he was taken to where he's buried, I presume, and he met not a very nice end. They said their ammunition was spent as well, and one of the versions of the story I heard was that he was more or less bludgeoned to death, so he died roaring.
Joe, can I ask what it means to you and to the whole community here to have an auxiliary lying amongst you?
Well, it's history. We believe he's the only auxiliary soldier to be buried in Ireland, but I believe that he's part of the story of Ireland. I respect him and respect all the dead in that churchyard.
During the War of Independence, only a small proportion of IRA volunteers were directly involved in activities such as ambushes, attacks on barracks, assassinations and executions. In Cork, the figure is perhaps 600 such fighting men. The Cork IRA were remarkably effective at taking the war to their enemies. This was in part because they attacked a lot of civilians. The late Peter Hart calculates that perhaps 200 civilians were attacked by the Cork IRA. Some were killed, some were wounded, some were exiled to Britain and elsewhere. Sean Healy, an IRA captain in Cork City, even declared to the Bureau of Military History that spies had to be liquidated in the public streets. Sean O'Hegarty's Cork No. 1 Brigade had a reputation for killing first and not asking questions afterwards. During the truce, when IRA headquarters inquired about missing persons, a brigade officer replied, "Persons shot during the war are not to be inquired into, as all were spies." Cork is also one of a handful of counties where the IRA deliberately executed women. Bridget Noble of Castletownbere, an unknown woman in Carrigtwohill, and the most famous case, that of Mrs. Mary Lindsay of Coachford. I'm standing here at the site of the famous Gypsy Ambush. The 6th Battalion, Cork No. 1 Brigade, laid a major ambush here for a convoy of British troops. Unfortunately, their preparations soon became widely known locally. Mrs. Mary Lindsay, an elderly loyalist widow, heard of the plans and went to warn the British authorities. But she also asked a local priest to warn the IRA, giving them plenty of time to escape. Father Shinnick conveyed a warning to the IRA in good time. But, incredibly, his warning was ignored. Just after the truce, Sean O'Hegarty, the commanding officer of Cork No. 1 Brigade, sent on a report to GHQ that stated, "Father Shinnick was not taken seriously, as he was always preaching from the altar against ambushes." Having now been informed of the ambush, the British Army mounted an encircling movement. Taken by surprise, the IRA retreated, losing 1 man. 7 others were captured. 6 of these were later tried by Court Martial of Victoria Barracks. 5 were sentenced to death. 2 weeks later, the IRA kidnapped Mrs. Lindsay and her servant, James Clark. It was hoped that this would force the British to cancel the executions of the 5 IRA volunteers. Mrs. Lindsay was obliged to write a letter to General Strickland, commanding the 6th Division in Cork, pleading with him for clemency for the IRA men.
Dear Sir Peter, I have just heard that some of the prisoners taken at Gypsy are to be executed on Monday, and I write to get you to use your influence to prevent this taking place and try and reprieve them. I am a prisoner, as I'm sure you will know, and I have been told that it would be a very serious matter for me if these men are executed. I have been told that my life will be forfeited for theirs, as they believe that I was the direct cause of their capture. I implore you to spare these men for my sake. Yours very truly, M. Lindsay.
Strickland discussed the matter with General Macready, the officer commanding British forces in Ireland. Neither man believed that the IRA would dare to kill an elderly woman hostage, and they agreed that the Cork executions should go ahead. On the 28th of February 1921, 5 of the volunteers captured at Gypsy were shot by firing squad in Cork. Mrs. Lindsay and James Clark were now living on borrowed time. Some days later, they were taken out into a field and shot dead, and their bodies were buried. It's said that Mrs. Lindsay faced her killers defiantly. In July 1921, Cathal Brugha, the Minister for Defence, actually ordered Mrs. Lindsay's release, unaware that she and Clark were already 4 months dead. In succeeding years, efforts to recover their bodies failed. The IRA men who had killed them wouldn't give them up. In fact, they twice dug up Mrs. Lindsay and removed her remains. Ultimately, they incinerated them. This was a very odd end to a very tragic case. The 11th of July 1921 saw the truce come into effect. The War of Independence was over. The signing of the treaty followed 5 months later. For much of the country, peace was now restored, but in Cork City, the killings continued. For the period up to the outbreak of the Civil War, much of Cork No. 1 Brigade's resources were poured into settling old scores. As one commentator observed, it was as if the IRA had nothing in its collective mind but revenge. I met Dr. Ger Murphy, the author of The Year of Disappearances, to discuss the phenomenon of these revenge killings. Ger, one of the most disturbing aspects of this whole project is how many people were killed after the truce and the treaty. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, there would have been quite a number of people picked up in the city after the truce and into 1922.
The Cork IRA didn't just abduct adults. Children were also targeted.
Edward Parsons, who was a 15-year-old kid, I was looking for him for 5 or 6 years before I stumbled on a little notice in the Cork Examiner looking for information on his disappearance.
What was the date of that?
The date of that was around the 23rd of March 1922.
Missing since March 23, William Edward Parsons, 30 High Street, Cork, age 15, height 5 feet 5 inches, brown hair, hazel eyes, was wearing black overcoat, blue jacket and green waistcoat, trousers and cap. Information gladly received by his parents.
There is no question but young Parsons was brought down to Corries and they extracted information out of him.
We can do this 2 ways. We can either hang you or shoot you.
Corrie claimed that he gave 6 names who were supposedly subsequently killed in Corries, but that's speculative. The Parsons family left immediately after the young lad disappearing. They were an English family, and they moved back to Brighton, which is where they came from first. She tried everything to find out what happened to the young lad.
Could you possibly do anything in the way of finding out what has become of my son, who was kidnapped in Cork on the 23rd of March 1922? He was last seen alive at 9:20 p.m. when he said goodbye to his chum at the top of the Southern Road and within 15 yards of his home. He was in no way connected to any movement. He belonged to the Boys Brigade and the YMCA. I have made all possible inquiries, went to the Free Staters, Republicans, the Lord Mayor, the Roman Catholic Bishop, the Fathers, and our Bishop, and received no satisfaction. The Republicans at Union Quay Barracks said to hold out no hope, as there were a lot shot. We advertised in the Cork newspapers, but the same cry. No news.
You were saying it wasn't all sort of death and darkness up here around Knockgraha.
Well, I mean, there was decent things done as well, and there was decent people. There was one man had a couple of soldiers to be executed one night up here near the Ray, and he went out in the shed and he interviewed them, and he discovered there were two 17-year-olds who had just joined the British Army a couple of weeks earlier in Bristol. They thought they were going to London, to India,
yeah,
and they were fished up into Cork, and they were picked up in Cork and brought out to be executed. So he put them into the horse and trap and took them into Cork and left them off. That was, I suppose, his conscience getting to him, you know?
Yeah. How many bodies do you think could possibly be buried in Knockgraha?
Well, I'd say the most conservative figure is something in the region of 30. This is what the locals maintain. McLeahy, who was the commander in the area, he told Ernie O'Malley that there was up to 90 killed there, and that was, as he put it, an excellent spot for executions. That's
in the Ernie O'Malley notebook.
That's in the Ernie O'Malley notebooks. That's a lot of people.
More evidence of the IRA's policy of disappearing people was unearthed in the early 1960s, when a number of bodies were dug up from a field in Knockgraha. Martin Corry recalls this story.
You were saying something about number better than Jenny Callan's fields, you were saying?
I counted them all up here one time and I got about 37 of them. Between Tans and Camerons and Spies was the graveyard. I sent word to him not to drain the field. Fair warning. When he opened the big furrow right down through the middle of it, he got 2 Tans above the top anyway. And then he lifted 6 more fellas in a bundle below together. But he stopped in. He had enough.
What I've explored during this journey through our country are darker aspects of the War of Independence and its aftermath. With war comes an inevitable loss of life, but the sad fact is here, many civilians were wrongly killed. With the words of Martin Corry ringing in my ears, I turned for home. However, once on the road, I decided to make one final detour, to visit a famous Cork shrine to the faithful. The last time I was here on this hill just south of Fermoy was 1973. I accompanied my grandfather Jim Maloney to a 50th anniversary commemoration for his Civil War commander Liam Lynch. I met many IRA veterans that day. I only wish I'd taken the opportunity to find out more about the independence struggle. But of course, I wouldn't have known what questions to ask. I wonder what those dignified old men would have had to say about the secret killing of spies and informers. Surely those veterans would agree that it's now time to seek truth and justice for the disappeared. Where's their memorial? These victims have been forgotten for far too long. This list includes only people whom we know with certainty were disappeared by the IRA and were never found. The true figure is significantly higher.